When you think of Henry VIII's children, images of the zealous Bloody Mary or the iconic Elizabeth likely spring to mind. But there existed another heir, Edward VI, whose brief reign unveiled a chilling darkness that even his infamous father might have found unsettling. Ascending the throne at the tender age of 9, Edward VI seemingly transformed from an innocent child into one of England's most merciless rulers before meeting a demise shrouded in mystery, forever haunting the Tudor legacy. This narrative transcends the tale of a young boy succumbing to illness. It delves into the insidious nature of absolute power and its corrupting influence, even within a child's grasp. The revelations surrounding Edward's final days will challenge preconceived notions about the Tudor dynasty and its profound impact on England. The year was 1537, and Henry VIII's long-awaited dream materialized, a legitimate male heir. Edward's birth was met with jubilant celebrations across England, a beacon of hope amidst decades of dynastic instability. Yet his arrival carried a heavy price. His mother, Jane Seymour, passed away a mere 12 days after giving birth, leaving the infant prince motherless and further magnifying his significance in the eyes of his increasingly paranoid father. From his earliest moments, Edward was not treated as a child, but as England's future savior. He was surrounded by guards, tutors, and courtiers who relentlessly emphasized his divine destiny. This isolation from the simple joys of childhood would become the foundation for a personality marked by both intellectual brilliance and a profound lack of empathy. Unlike his sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, who had experienced their father's capricious nature, Edward knew only unwavering praise and adoration. Henry VIII, perhaps burdened by guilt over his treatment of his daughters, lavished his son with affection that bordered on reverence. The young prince received instruction from the most esteemed tutors money could procure, but these were not merely educators. They were fervent Protestant theologians handpicked to mold Edward into the ideal Protestant king. From the age of 6, Edward immersed himself in not only Latin and Greek, but also intricate theological treatises denouncing Catholicism and asserting the divine right of Protestant monarchs to absolute rule. The education meticulously crafted by Henry VIII was more akin to indoctrination than genuine learning. Edward's primary tutor, John Check, a brilliant scholar and zealous reformer, filled the boy's mind with visions of England as a modern Jerusalem, cleansed of Catholic corruption. Each lesson, be it history, philosophy, or statecraft, was filtered through the prism of Protestant supremacy and royal absolutism. By the age of 8, Edward could eloquently articulate theological arguments justifying the persecution of Catholics and asserting that any opposition to his future reign would be an act against God himself. The particularly insidious aspect of Edward's upbringing lay in the fusion of intellectual prowess with complete emotional detachment. While capable of engaging in complex theological debates with university professors, he was deprived of the joys of playing with other children or experiencing normal human connections. His sole companions were adults who regarded him with awe, fostering a boy who possessed a sophisticated understanding of political theory but lacked a fundamental grasp of human empathy or the inherent value of individual life. This dangerous cocktail of supreme intelligence and stunted emotional development would profoundly shape his future reign. In the autumn of 1547, England found itself under the rule of a 9-year-old boy, a monarch raised to believe he was God's chosen instrument on earth. Edward VI ascended to the throne following the death of Henry VIII, inheriting not only a crown, but a kingdom simmering with religious discord. The young king had been molded by the most radical Protestant tutors his father could find, men who had instilled in him visions of religious purity and absolute authority. Unlike his older sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, who had first-hand experience of their father's wrath, Edward had been shielded, praised, and indoctrinated from birth with the belief that he was destined for greatness. This perilous combination of perceived divine authority and youthful inflexibility would prove devastating for many of his subjects. The England that Edward inherited was a volatile landscape of religious factions. His father had severed ties with Rome and established the Church of England. Yet the country remained deeply divided between Catholics, moderate Protestants, and radical reformers. Edward's Regency Council, initially led by his uncle Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, seemed to promise a period of moderate governance. However, the young king harbored his own distinct ideas about the governance of England. From From his initial council meetings, Edward displayed an unsettling blend of youthful stubbornness and cold calculation, interrupting seasoned advisors to lecture them on Protestant doctrine. Contemporary observers were struck by the swiftness with which the 9-year-old king began asserting his authority. Within weeks of his coronation, Edward was personally scrutinizing death sentences and exhibiting a disturbing eagerness for the execution of those he deemed heretics. Court records from this era paint a portrait of a child who approached matters of life and death as intellectual exercises, debating the theological justifications for various punishments with the same detachment he might employ in discussing Latin grammar. Witnesses recounted that Edward would often smile while signing death warrants, seemingly pleased by his ability to find scriptural support for each execution. The boy king's early reign was characterized by what courtiers discreetly termed religious outbursts, explosive fits of anger whenever anyone advocated for moderation in religious policy. Edward had absorbed his tutor's teachings so completely that he genuinely believed any compromise with Catholic practices was a personal betrayal of Christ. When an advisor suggested allowing some Catholic nobles to continue practicing their faith privately, Edward reportedly hurled his inkwell at the man, proclaiming that God would punish England for such weakness. While these incidents were initially dismissed as childish tantrums, they were, in reality, indicative of a truly dangerous religious zealot in the making. Perhaps most unsettling was Edward's apparent lack of typical childhood interests. While other 9-year-olds engaged in play, Edward devoted his time to studying accounts of the Spanish Inquisition and meticulously documenting interrogation techniques. His personal servants reported discovering drawings in his chambers depicting various methods of torture, accompanied by Edward's commentary on their effectiveness in extracting confessions from heretics. The boy who should have been learning to ride horses was instead studying the most efficient means of breaking human bodies and spirits in service of his Protestant vision. What rendered Edward particularly dangerous was the fusion of his religious fanaticism with the immense power of royal authority. While his advisors engaged in political maneuvering, the boy king absorbed every lesson on the divine right of kings with alarming enthusiasm. He meticulously kept journals of his reign, documents that revealed a child who reveled in descriptions of executions, religious persecutions, and the suffering of those he considered heretics. By the age of 10, Edward was personally composing sermons that were delivered in churches throughout England, sermons that called for the complete eradication of Catholic influence and promised divine retribution for anyone who showed mercy to heretics. The young king's cruelty extended beyond religious matters. Edward exhibited a vindictive streak that shocked even seasoned courtiers who had served his ruthless father. When servants displeased him, Edward would devise elaborate punishments designed more to humiliate than to correct their behavior. One unfortunate page who spilled wine on Edward's papers was forced to stand in the courtyard for hours while courtiers pelted him with rotten food, all at the specific instruction of the 11-year-old king. Edward observed these humiliations with evident pleasure, often taking notes on the victims' reactions as if conducting scientific experiments. The boy king's journal entries from this period revealed a mind increasingly detached from normal human emotion. Edward wrote about the suffering of others with the same clinical detachment he used to describe the weather, noting details of pain and fear as interesting observations rather than tragedies. When a kitchen maid died after being flogged on Edward's orders for allegedly practicing Catholic prayers, the young king's sole comment was to note that the correction proved more effective than anticipated in preventing the subject from further error. Edward's treatment of his own family offered perhaps the most compelling evidence of his developing sociopathic tendencies. Despite being raised alongside his sisters during his early childhood, Edward displayed no genuine affection for Mary or Elizabeth once he ascended the throne. Instead, he viewed them through the same religious lens he applied to all his subjects. Mary was a dangerous Catholic who needed to be controlled or eliminated, while Elizabeth was a potential ally whose Protestant leanings made her marginally more acceptable. For Edward, family relationships were reduced to political calculations. This chilling detachment became even more evident when Edward's uncle, Thomas Seymour, attempted to gain influence over him through gifts and flattery. Rather than being swayed by kindness, Edward interpreted Thomas's overtures as attempts to manipulate him and responded with cold calculation. When Thomas was arrested on charges of treason, Edward not only endorsed his execution, but reportedly watched from his window as the man who had once shown him kindness was dragged to the scaffold. Witnesses recounted that the boy king showed no emotion as the axe fell, instead making notes in his journal about the effectiveness of different execution methods. As Edward entered his 12th year, his authoritarian tendencies intensified dramatically. The boy, who had once seemed frail and bookish, began exerting direct control over government policy, frequently overruling his advisors when he deemed them too lenient. His Protestant reforms became increasingly draconian, with mandatory church attendance enforced by networks of informants and severe penalties for any deviation from approved doctrine. Edward personally designed a system of religious surveillance that would have impressed the Spanish Inquisition, with neighbors encouraged to spy on neighbors and children rewarded for reporting their parents' religious transgressions. The king's obsession with control extended to every facet of English religious life. Edward issued meticulous regulations governing not only public worship, but also private devotions, dictating precisely how his subjects should pray, what they should believe, and even how they should think about God. Violation of these regulations was treated as treason against both the crown and God, with punishments ranging from public humiliation to imprisonment and death. The boy king personally reviewed every case, often increasing the recommended punishments because he felt the original sentences lacked sufficient zeal for Protestant purity. Edward established what amounted to a thought police, incentivizing subjects to report on their neighbors' religious practices with rewards for successful denunciations. The young king took personal pleasure in reading these reports, often summoning the accusers to court to elicit additional details about their neighbors' supposed transgressions. Those found guilty of Catholic sympathies faced imprisonment, torture, or death, with the young king personally reviewing and often escalating the recommended punishments. Edward's court became a breeding ground for paranoia and fanaticism, where mercy was seen as weakness and zealotry was rewarded. The machinery of persecution that Edward created was remarkable for its systematic nature and the king's direct involvement in its operation. Unlike adult rulers who might delegate such matters to subordinates, Edward insisted on reviewing every case personally, meticulously studying the details of each accused person's alleged crimes, and often devising specific punishments tailored to what he perceived as their particular theological errors. His journals from this period read like manuals for religious persecution, filled with detailed discussions of which punishments were most effective for different types of heresy. What made Edward's persecution particularly chilling was his ability to combine childish creativity with deadly serious intent. When traditional punishments proved insufficient, the teenage king would devise novel forms of humiliation and suffering, always justified by elaborate theological arguments. One Catholic priest who refused to renounce his faith was forced to carry a sign proclaiming "Enemy of Christ" through the streets of London, while children pelted him with stones, all at Edward's explicit direction. The king observed this spectacle from his palace window, reportedly laughing at the priest's suffering while dictating observations to his secretary. The king's obsession with religious purity extended to his own family, revealing a complete absence of natural affection. Edward viewed his half-sister Mary, a devout Catholic, not as family, but as the greatest threat to his Protestant England. In private letters that have survived, Edward wrote about Mary with a hatred that was both childish and terrifying, referring to her as the bastard and Christ's enemy, while devising ways to have her declared illegitimate or even executed for heresy. The boy, who should have felt brotherly affection, instead harbored fantasies of seeing his sister burn at the stake for her religious beliefs. Edward's animosity towards Mary transcended mere political calculation. It appeared to consume him with a personal intensity that troubled even his most radical advisors. The young king spent hours constructing scenarios in which he could legally remove Mary from the line of succession, consulting with Protestant lawyers who were all too willing to find legal justifications for what amounted to fratricide. Court observers noted that Edward's demeanor would darken whenever Mary's name was mentioned, and he would often retreat to his chambers to pen lengthy diatribes about the theological necessity of excluding her from the line of succession. The boy king's plans for dealing with Mary became increasingly elaborate and cruel. Edward drafted detailed scenarios for Mary's arrest, trial, and execution, replete with specific charges of heresy and treason. He even composed what he intended to be Mary's confession, forcing her to renounce Catholicism and acknowledge her illegitimate birth, before being granted the mercy of a swift death by beheading rather than burning at the stake. These documents, preserved in the royal archives, reveal a mind that had traversed far beyond normal political rivalry and descended into genuine sociopathic hatred. Edward's treatment of Elizabeth was more complex, but equally unsettling. While he approved of her Protestant beliefs, he regarded his younger sister primarily as a useful tool for his religious agenda rather than as family. Edward intended to leverage Elizabeth's eventual marriage as a means of solidifying Protestant alliances regarding her future happiness as inconsequential compared to the political advantages her marriage might bring to his cause. Even his relatively positive feelings toward Elizabeth were filtered through his religious obsessions, making it evident that his sister's value to him was purely instrumental. The king's inability to cultivate normal family relationships extended to his broader court as well. Edward treated his nobles, advisors, and servants not as individuals with intrinsic worth, but as pawns on a chessboard, to be moved according to his religious and political strategies. Those who served him faithfully for years could find themselves discarded or even executed if they displayed insufficient enthusiasm for his increasingly extreme policies. Loyalty to Edward mandated complete subservience to his vision of Protestant England, with no room for personal conscience or moral reservations. When Edward began to exhibit signs of serious illness in early 1553, his behavior became even more erratic and cruel. Rather than mellowing in the face of mortality, the 15-year-old king became fixated on ensuring that his Protestant reforms would outlive him. He recognized that Mary's accession would signify the restoration of Catholicism, and this realization drove him to increasingly desperate measures. The prospect of his life's work being undone by his Catholic sister filled Edward with a rage that bordered on madness, prompting him to contemplate solutions that would have appalled even his tyrannical father. The young king's failing health seemed to amplify rather than temper his extremism. As Edward grew weaker physically, his religious fervor burned even brighter, as if he were attempting to condense a lifetime of Protestant purification into his remaining months. Court physicians reported that the king's illness was accompanied by periods of fevered preaching, during which he would deliver rambling sermons about the imperative to eliminate Catholic influence, even if it necessitated the slaughter of every Catholic in England. While these rants were initially dismissed as delirium, Edward's lucid moments revealed that his extreme statements reflected genuine intentions rather than sickness-induced ravings. Edward began secretly convening with Protestant extremists, plotting a coup that would circumvent both Mary and Elizabeth in favor of his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey. The conspiracy that emerged was audacious and ruthless, encompassing plans to arrest or assassinate both of his sisters and install a puppet regime controlled by Protestant fanatics. The 15-year-old king, despite his physical frailty, threw himself into these planning sessions with an energy that both amazed and terrified his co-conspirators. The details of Edward's final plot laid bare the full extent of his transformation from innocent child to aspiring tyrant. Collaborating with John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, Edward devised a plan that would have resulted in the deaths of both his sisters and the establishment of a Protestant regime more radical than anything England had ever witnessed. The conspiracy included provisions for mass executions of Catholic nobles, the confiscation of all Catholic properties, and the establishment of a permanent religious police force that would monitor every aspect of English life. Edward's personal involvement in planning these atrocities was both meticulous and enthusiastic. The dying king spent his final weeks drafting lists of Catholics to be executed, properties to be seized, and laws to be enacted in his Protestant utopia. His handwriting, increasingly unsteady due to his illness, filled page after page with plans for what amounted to religious genocide. The boy who had once seemed like an innocent victim of political manipulation revealed himself to be the mastermind behind a conspiracy that would have rendered the Spanish Inquisition merciful by comparison. However, Edward's illness took a cruel turn that appeared almost like divine retribution for his planned atrocities. Modern medical analysis suggests that the young king suffered from a combination of tuberculosis and suspected arsenic poisoning, possibly administered by his own physicians in a misguided attempt to alleviate his condition. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers. The king who had poisoned England with religious hatred was himself being slowly poisoned by the very individuals attempting to save his life. As the poisons gradually ravaged his body, Edward experienced hallucinations and episodes of madness that were interpreted by his courtiers as religious visions. The boy who had shown no mercy to others spent his final weeks in torment, his body racked with agony as he slowly withered away. Court physicians noted that Edward's suffering seemed to intensify his religious zeal rather than providing any spiritual solace, as if his physical torment was fueling his mental obsessions rather than purifying them. The manner of Edward's death was particularly gruesome for those who witnessed it. Court physicians recorded that the young king's body began to emit a putrid odor weeks before his death, and his skin acquired a greenish hue suggestive of severe poisoning. Edward's hair and fingernails began to fall out, and he experienced violent convulsions that left him temporarily paralyzed. The boy, who had once been regarded as one of the most handsome of Henry VIII's children, became a grotesque caricature of his former self, his body seemingly revolting against the poison that was consuming him. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the king remained lucid enough to comprehend what was happening to him, spending his final days alternating between screams of physical pain and fevered tirades about Protestant martyrs. Edward's last coherent conversations centered not on reconciliation or forgiveness, but on his regret that he would not live to complete his planned purification of England. The dying king implored his conspirators to proceed with their plot even in his absence, assuring them that God would reward their fidelity in establishing his Protestant paradise. The young king's final hours were a grotesque parody of a deathbed scene. Instead of seeking forgiveness or expressing love for his family, Edward spent his last breath cursing his Catholic sister and praying for God to shield Protestant England from what he called Mary's wickedness. Witnesses reported that his final words were not of peace, but of hatred, a fitting end to a life consumed by religious fanaticism and political extremism. When Edward finally succumbed to death on July 6, 1553, the relief among his courtiers was palpable, though few expressed it openly. The boy king, who had promised to be England's salvation, had instead become its nightmare, and his death offered the only escape from increasingly extreme policies that were steering the kingdom towards civil war. Even his most devoted supporters privately conceded that Edward's death might have been a blessing for England, though they would never have admitted such thoughts publicly. The immediate aftermath of Edward's death revealed the degree to which his meticulously crafted plans rested on the foundation of his personal authority. Without the king's driving will behind the conspiracy, it unraveled within days. As moderate Protestants disavowed what they now recognized as an extremist plot, Lady Jane Grey, the intended beneficiary of Edward's coup, found herself virtually abandoned. Mary's successful claim to the throne was supported not only by Catholics, but also by moderate Protestants who were appalled by what Edward's reign had revealed about the potential for religious extremism. The boy king, who had aspired to become England's greatest Protestant champion, had instead ensured that his reign would be primarily remembered for its cruelty and the relief that accompanied his death. Even committed Protestants found themselves welcoming Catholic Mary as a preferable alternative to the continued rule of Protestant extremists. The irony of Edward's story extends far beyond his failed succession plans. The young king, who had been so consumed with eradicating Catholic influence, inadvertently strengthened it through his extremism. His persecution of moderate voices within the Protestant movement had left English Protestantism dominated by zealots who alienated ordinary believers rather than attracting them. By the time of his death, many English Protestants were beginning to perceive Catholicism as a refuge from the increasingly harsh demands of Edward's brand of Reformed religion. Modern historians have begun to reevaluate Edward's reign, and the picture that emerges is far darker than the traditional narrative of a sickly boy manipulated by ambitious advisors. Court records and private correspondence reveal a young man who was genuinely enthusiastic about persecution and exhibited disturbing indications of deriving pleasure from the suffering of others. Edward's personal involvement in planning executions and his detailed journals documenting torture methods suggest that England was ruled for 6 years by what can only be described as a child psychopath wielding absolute power. The transformation of Edward from innocent child to cruel tyrant offers unsettling insights into the corrupting nature of absolute authority. Unlike adult rulers who might retain some capacity for empathy or political calculation, Edward's complete isolation from normal human relationships and his unwavering belief in his own divine authority created a perfect storm of cruelty. The boy who had never been refused anything and who believed that opposition to his will was inherently sinful became capable of atrocities that shocked even the violent Tudor age. Contemporary accounts suggest that Edward's courtiers were increasingly alarmed by their young king's behavior but felt powerless to restrain him. The same divine right doctrine that legitimized his rule also rendered any opposition to his will tantamount to blasphemy, leaving even his closest advisors unable to temper his increasingly extreme policies. The boy king had established a system in which his slightest whim became law, and his escalating taste for cruelty had no check except death itself. Perhaps most chilling of all is the question of what might have transpired had Edward lived to reach adulthood. His plans for Protestant England included the establishment of a permanent religious police force, the complete elimination of the Catholic nobility, and the creation of a surveillance state that would have monitored every aspect of his subjects' private lives. The teenager who died in 1553 had already begun implementing these policies on a limited scale, and there is every reason to believe that a mature Edward VI would have created one of history's most oppressive regimes. The legacy of Edward VI serves as a somber reminder that evil can emanate from the most unexpected sources and that noble intentions can be perverted by unchecked power and religious fanaticism. The boy king who believed he was saving England's soul nearly destroyed its body, and his death may have been the greatest act of mercy his reign could have offered his subjects. His story stands as a cautionary tale about the perils of combining absolute authority with ideological certainty, particularly in the hands of someone too young to fully grasp the consequences of their actions. Edward's story also underscores the dangerous confluence of youth, power, and ideology. While adult tyrants might be constrained by political pragmatism or personal relationships, Edward's utter isolation and unwavering belief in his own righteousness rendered him capable of contemplating atrocities that even seasoned political operators found appalling. The child who should have been playing with toys was instead planning mass executions and religious purges, treating human lives as expendable resources in his quest for religious purity. The boy king's reign also illustrates how education can devolve into indoctrination when it lacks balance in human perspective. Edward's tutors cultivated a brilliant theological scholar, but a moral monster, someone who could construct elaborate intellectual justifications for cruelty, but who had never learned basic human empathy. His story serves as a warning about the dangers of any educational system that prioritizes ideological purity over human decency. Ultimately, Edward VI's brief reign stands as one of history's most unsettling examples of how power can corrupt innocence. The boy who began as Henry VIII's cherished heir ended as a figure so terrifying that his own death was celebrated by his subjects. His transformation from protected child to aspiring tyrant reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature and the particular dangers posed by those who believe their cruelty serves a higher purpose. The death of Edward VI marked not only the end of a life, but also the end of what might have been England's darkest possible future. The boy king's final agony, racked with pain and consumed with hatred for his own family, serves as a fitting conclusion to a reign that had promised so much hope, but delivered only fear. In dying young, Edward VI may have inadvertently performed his greatest service to the England he claimed to love, sparing it from the full realization of his terrible vision, a legacy forever stained by the chilling potential for darkness that resided within a boy king. So, there you have it, the unsettling story of Edward VI, a boy king whose reign casts a long shadow on the Tudor dynasty. It's a stark reminder that power, especially when combined with unwavering conviction and youthful inexperience, can be a dangerous force, leading even the most promising individuals down a path of darkness. Ultimately, Edward's story is a powerful, albeit chilling illustration of the corrupting influence of absolute power and the importance of empathy and balance in leadership. What are your thoughts on Edward VI? Did anything in particular surprise you? Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your perspective and discuss this fascinating yet disturbing chapter of English history with you. And if you found this exploration of the Tudor dynasty intriguing, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future deep dives into history's most compelling figures and events. Thanks for watching.